So a new official survey came out a few weeks back of Blizzard asking us which new specs we would like to see, and amongst a bunch of them, two really stand out. They stand out because they're technically brand new classes just presented as new specs. One is the healer mage, aka the Chronomancer, and the other is the necromancer lich hybrid that is presented as a ranged DPS Death Knight. In the last item, we are returning to North. Frozen Throne has been confirmed in a recent interview to be relevant, and with that, the Death Knights will be relevant once again. Could this lich-necromancer spec be a way for them to make up for the scrap necromancer back from Rat? And what really is this Chronomancer they're talking about? A whole bunch of really interesting concepts that they're obviously working on behind the scenes, so let's check out everything we know. So something I found really annoying is having games just all over the place. WoW on Battle.net, Witcher on GOG, and a bunch of others on Steam. Well, playtracker.net is the perfect free solution to this as an amazing integration tool. But it's not just that. You can not only organize everything in one single unified profile, but you got unified achievements, all the playtime in one place, you can connect with friends cross-platform, and also a really cool quest and leveling system where you gain XP and levels to unlock a whole bunch of cool features. So connect all the profiles right now with my link in the description below with playtracker.net. So if you guys remember, Blizzard has been flirting with a new class and spec for quite a while now. I covered this a bit more than a year back, about a year and a half back, when we first got a really detailed survey about potential new classes, and here it just kind of seemed like they were throwing everything they could think of from the whiteboard about potential new classes, and you know, they're talking about thinkers, astrologians, apothecaries, probably just chucking every idea at the public to see what people stick to. They really went crazy on these. I mean, some random names are like Celestial Lancers and Titan Killers and a whole bunch of other concepts. Now, realistically, a new class is very likely possible in The Last Titan, but something they followed up on recently isn't a new class, but actually a new spec. Interesting enough, the new specs they mentioned are technically classes of their own, just kind of contained as a spec within a single class. What I mean is like how you have the Shadow and the Light Priests, which are literally two entirely different classes and concepts, but they're contained in one class. This is sort of what they had in mind with a few of the ones they mentioned in the new survey. Now, I want to look at the pattern here from the old survey and the new one, and kind of what actually stuck and what they're kind of repeating. The new survey is also kind of a bit over the place with some sort of wild classes, but you gotta admit, it isn't nearly as wild. All of these are essentially completely realistic. It's just that some of them are quite boring and sort of generic, like DPS Holy Priest and Support Paladin. Some are a bit wild, like a Healer Hunter, which is like a hunter that uses first aid to heal and then your pet delivers bandages. Definitely a little bit strange sounding. The two that really stuck though, and that make the most amount of sense with the way the World Soul Saga is currently going, as we're kind of in the middle of it, are the Chronomancer and the Necromancer. These two are actually long requested classes, and if you look between the lines with this survey, you can see that this is exactly what they are talking about. The healer mage they mentioned is the Chronomancer, and the ranged DPS Death Knight is essentially a necromancer lich hybrid. Now, to jump real quick to the old survey, the necromancer directly was mentioned there. They described it as summoning an undead army and combining spells to empower this army. You didn't really need a description for this because the Necromancer has been in the game since Warcraft 3, I mean, it's a very well-developed class in the lore. The Chronomancer, on the other hand, is a little bit more mystical. I mean, this Chronomancer concept has been around the community for a while now. We have speculated about it for a long time, and while we don't really have the explicit class like the Necromancer, Chronomancy, like by this name, is actually a magic that exists in the Warcraft lore. It is wielded by the Bronze Dragon fight that was quite relevant just one expansion ago. Now, in the first survey, it didn't specify this one, but they did talk about a bard that heals, and most importantly talked about a ley weaver that uses arcane power to help buff and debuff allies. Now, the Chronomancer they're talking about in the new survey is just called Healer Mage. The way Blizzard describes it is using arcane magic to alter the reality of time to cure wounds of your allies and to preemptively react to enemy combat by shielding and buffing enemies with elemental magic. I mean, this is literally, by definition, a Chronomancer, but also just a regular mage that uses arcane and elemental magic as well. What is really interesting about this is that Blizzard may have figured out a way to introduce a bunch of new classes, new concepts, but just the specs, which means they wouldn't have to go crazy with the balance of classes, as adding a bunch of new classes would be a huge headache and a problem for PvP and PvE. The reason these two make the most amount of sense, other than the tank, shaman and warlock, is because it could actually happen soon and it is relevant to the saga. For the ranged Death Knight, keep in mind we are going to Northrend in the next expansion. They hinted at the Frozen Throne being relevant again and the Scourge. That is where Death Knights became a thing, and it was also the famous missed chance for the scrapped Necromancer class that everyone was expecting back in Brad. This return to Northrend could be the big questline for the Death Knights to introduce this new spec. The spec they described is just called a ranged DPS Death Knight, unleashing the powers of a lich, wielding necrotic and frost magic to torment souls of your enemies, conjure corrupting phantasms, grasping hands and chains of ice to assail your foes, while avoiding death yourself within your phylactery. This is a really different and alternate take on a necromancer. It is actually a lich spec, but one that could actually work with the existing Death Knights. Technically, Death Knights can already raise some undead, so this aspect is kind of covered, but this necromancer wouldn't be focused on controlling undead and like skeletons as he would be on the other necromancer aspects. With the mention of the phylactery, this is 100% a lich, and what is a lich if not a necromancer? I mean, Kel'Thuzad was a lich, he was like the necromancer. So this lich-necromancer hybrid could actually be the way to go. I mean, they got multiple birds with one stone, making the Death Knights relevant for the last Titan, getting the necromancer finally covered, as well as introducing something completely unique. I mean, just the theme and lore based on this seems the most relevant out of all the specs. The other one I mentioned is also the bit more crazy one, and this is the healer mage Chronomancer. This one would be a completely new concept, but Northrend is also where this one could be relevant because they specifically mention arcane magic. We know Northrend is covered in ley lines, arcane magic, and also the bronze dragon fight is relevant there in Dragonblight, and the Titans are literally returning the actual physical embodiment of arcane magic. Furthermore, arcane is also quite relevant right now in Midnight with Sunwell, Quel'Thalas, and the Elves. The important thing to consider is that this most recent survey from a few weeks back is actually a lot more streamlined, a lot more down to earth, more like mid stages of production instead of the completely wild class ideas they sent us a bit more than a year ago. Pretty much all these could technically work, but I just don't see how getting another support priest or a support paladin or a DPS priest would be too interesting. I mean, like a holy DPS priest. These ones, other than the more interesting tank variations they mentioned, actually would introduce new classes to the game, but through the way of specs, which would make the job easier for them. They actually did something similar. It's not exactly a new class, but the Void Demon Hunters are in a way a different class, because the Demon Hunters, as you can see by the name, Demon Hunters are just fell magic specialists. I mean, them wielding the void makes them something entirely different. I think this is actually the way to go forward though, to stack more features for the last Titan to make the game more interesting. Regardless though, based on the evidence as well, I do think there is potential for a legit new class as well, probably something that could be drastically different, but on the other hand, it is also possible that they might just put more effort into a new race for the last Titan, and instead they might make it up by introducing 1 to 2 new specs, which could in a way be like a new class. Of course, too early to say anything for sure, we can only speculate, but it is 100% certain that they are working on something, otherwise they wouldn't send this survey a year back and a few weeks back as well. Based on the development of the surveys as well, it seems more like they're starting to like narrow things down, to zoom in, and we may be close to the actual reveal soon. Thanks for watching. Check out how Zelda may have been a priestess abandoned by the light in her mortal life by clicking on the screen, and check out my brand new Witcher channel that I just opened on Witcher lore that you can see by clicking on the screen as well. See you next time!